I've spent the majority of my life working in the outdoors as a soldier, outdoorsman, and guide. Many years ago, I came to a crossroad in my military career. I felt like I was at the point where I was no longer able to learn about survival from the military. So I searched and I watched as many new shows popped up like Dual Survival, Survivor Man, and others. Shows that partnered seasoned soldiers with primitive living instructors. I watched experienced soldiers who had amazing skills with tools fall short without them, and I had to look deep within myself and ask why. So, realizing that something was missing in my training, I then formulated a plan. I set out to find people with these skills in my area, to find out who they were, where they come from, who taught them, and more importantly, how could I learn and master these skills for myself. This journey has led me to a place where I have had the privilege of teaching these things that I love to others. Skills that now range from advanced navigation to primitive fire. This is my journey to primitive. This is my story, yet it is a story that has never really been about me.
So I'm Paul Kirtley from the UK. I teach bushcraft. I'm kind of really a generalist. I'm not one of these specialists that's kind of gone right down the rabbit hole with flint knapping or any particular skill, but I'm a general bushcraft instructor, and I have my own company, Frontier Bushcraft, and which I started in 2010, and so I've been going as of today, nearly 9 years, and yeah, it's been a real ride. And before that, I was working full time with Ray Mears. I was course director at Woodlaw for 5 years. Before that, I was part time as an assistant on courses at Woodlaw. So my kind of apprenticeship in terms of teaching wilderness skills, teaching bushcraft, was at Woodlaw. I'm also qualified as in the UK under the UK system as a mountain leader in the UK hills. I'm also qualified as a canoe leader and a canoe coach under the UK systems as well. So, I'm an outdoor educator, but my focus is bushcraft, and I've got the other kind of journeying skills and quals to go with that, and that's me. So my role really is teaching people bushcraft, guiding people on trips, and getting people where they want to be with their abilities in the outdoors. It's not necessarily a very good business model, but I want to enable people to go and do the things that they want by, giving them a combination of, the bushcraft and the woodcraft and the campcraft skills along with the journeying skills. That's kind of my MO, as it were. So that's me. Yeah, so sort of my jumping off point into outdoor education as a career was when Ray Mears offered me a role as an assistant to him on courses in 2003. So that's where I sort of jumped from a guy that was doing courses at Woodlaw to somebody who was working at Woodlaw. So I was learning skills before that, but my interest goes a long way back, a lot further back than that. So I grew up in rural areas. My family moved around a little bit for my father's work, but we were always in rural areas. I'd never lived in a town or a city until I was 18, when I went to college in Edinburgh in Scotland. But before that, I'd always lived in the countryside. I lived in North Wales with a bunch of forest around us. I lived in the north of England, which was more open fields and moorland and whatnot, but it was always rural. And so I always felt quite connected with nature. We were always, I was a pre-computer generation. I got a little 48K computer when I was maybe about 11 or 12, but we only ever used it when it was too wet, too heavy rain to go outside. Otherwise, we'd be out. My friends and I would be outside. So we were always outside. So I've always loved being outdoors. So it goes right back to childhood. I used to run around in the forest behind where we lived in North Wales when I was 7 or 8 years old. It's just what I always did. And in terms of the skills, that kind of came in, I guess, in my early teens. There were a few publications in the UK around that time. all kind of at the survival end, because bushcraft really as a term didn't register for a while. So there was a magazine called Combat and Survival Skills, I think it was called, and there was another one called Survival Weaponry and Techniques. But it was the survival skills, you know, how to skin a rabbit and how to make a trap and how to purify water and all of those skills that I was interested in. So I started, you know, I used to buy, you know, use some of my pocket money to buy some of those things. And then my dad got me, when I was 13, he got me Lofty Wiseman's Survival Handbook, which is a common theme, and particularly in the UK. A lot of us kind of a certain age. I'm 46 now, so that was like 33 years ago. My dad got me this book, and you know, a lot of the other UK guys that have been into this stuff, guys and girls that have been into this stuff for a long time, they cite that book as being kind of instrumental, because it was more than a survival book. You know, it was about, you know, the resources and nature, and it was global, and it was just fascinating. You know, how it was almost like, you know, how kids used to go through an encyclopedia looking at all the interesting stuff from around the world. It was kind of like that, but it was about that subject that we all nerd out about, you know, the survival stuff. So yeah, so my friends and I, we used to, once we got some of those resources, we were like, let's try this. You know, and we were a 13-year-old kid, so we weren't doing things particularly well, but we were going out and trying to make shelters and trying to figure out trap mechanisms and just mucking around in the woods, but mucking around in the woods with a bit more purpose once we started to get a little bit of input from the resources. And then, as I say, I was reasonably academic at school as well. I did well at school in terms of my, you know, school exams and things. And I went to Edinburgh University, which is a good university in the UK, to study mathematics. But then I'd never really spent a lot of time in Scotland, so then I got into hiking and backpacking in the Highlands, and I was really into mountain biking then as well. So again, even though I was living in the city, I was still doing a lot of stuff outdoors, jumping on a train and going up to the Highlands and doing hiking trips and things. But that was kind of, I guess there was a kind of evolution there where I sort of moved away from just sort of mucking around in the woods as a teenager to, I was a student doing a degree. And then my outdoor recreation became, I guess, a little bit more mainstream in some ways, you know, backpacking and mountain biking and stuff. Then I kind of came, you know, after I graduated and I was working in London. I was still heading up to the Highlands, doing those sorts of trips, and then I started doing hiking trips in the Pyrenees, you know, that sits between France and Spain, that spine that goes across. And I was starting to think, well, I'm doing more remote trips, and I sort of started to kind of re-drag out my interest in survival skills on one level, because I'm like, what happens if my stove doesn't work? What, you know, I don't want to just be completely reliant on my equipment. I want to be able to potentially be able to use resources and have more flexibility with ability to look after myself along the way. So that was one motivation. The other motivation, which I guess is a bit more at the sort of bushcraft end, is that there were a few wild foods that I knew, particularly from having lived in the country as a kid. And my parents were keen gardeners. We had a pretty big garden in North Wales, and it had, it wasn't like a beautiful manicured garden. It was kind of quite wild, and it literally backed straight onto a forest. So the only difference between the back of our garden and the forest was just a low barbed wire, like a low fence with a bit of barbed wire on the top, and that was it. And you were straight in the forest. So we had wild strawberries and all sorts of things growing in the garden. So I knew a few plants, because my parents had shown me them. And so I was doing this one sort of polarizing moment. I remember I was doing this hiking trip in the Pyrenees with a friend of mine, a friend from university, and we were camping in this lovely kind of alpine meadow. We were going up higher over this pass the next day, and there was this old like shepherd's hut on the edge of this meadow that was derelict, and the slate roof had sort of all slid off the back onto the slope that was behind it. And it was kind of like this natural rockery, and in amongst it were all these wild strawberry plants. And I'd just gone for a look around, mooch around this building, and I found all these plants behind. And so I was like, cool. So I grabbed my mug and I like collected a load of these. And they're tiny. They're like little tiny strawberries, not like the big juicy strawberries you get in the stores. The cultivated ones. So I collected like at least half a pint of these tiny little strawberries. And I was like, this is awesome, you know. And I went back to Mike, my friend. I was like, Mike, I found these wild strawberries. And he was like, they're too small to be strawberries. Are you sure they're strawberries? I'm like, yeah, they're strawberries. And anyway, he didn't want to eat them. He didn't trust me. I know. And I didn't really try and twist his arm too much, because I was like, I knew how good they were. So I was like, well, okay, well, if you don't want to eat them, you're lost. So I ate these wild strawberries. But that also made me think, what else is here that I could be making use of? I want to learn more about that end of things as well. So it's not what happens if things go wrong. It's just like, what can I use? What can I augment my trips with? So that then led me back into wanting to more formally learn, what are the wild edibles and that end of the spectrum. And so again, long story short, I accidentally found out about woodlaw. I knew about Ray Mears. He was starting to appear on television in the mid-90s, and he was in my kind of conscious brain in terms of someone who seemed to be sharing some good stuff. And then I accidentally, one day I was just browsing some websites in the late 90s, and I found a link to woodlaw, and then I found out that he was running courses, and I didn't know about that before, and then I ended up doing courses. So I had, in the meantime, I'd contacted Lofty Wiseman, because he was kind of my book mentor as a teenager, and I knew he used to teach down in Devon, in the southwest of the UK, but he'd stopped teaching at that point. So that was sort of disappointing. I was like, oh, okay, who else can I learn from? And I couldn't really find. There were some other ex-Special Forces guys who were running survival schools, but a lot of it was a lot of sort of navigation and almost challenge stuff. But I wanted the kind of core skills of using the natural resources. And so it wasn't until I found Ray and his courses that I found somebody that I could learn that from. So that's how that all linked together. So it goes right back to my childhood interest in this stuff. For me, at the core of the way I see bushcraft particularly is the trees and the plants. Once you get beyond that's a piece of wood, you can burn it, you've got to get a bit more nuanced, and so you need to start to be able to identify the particular resources and know the differences between what's good for cordage, what's really good for getting embers, and then you need to start to be able to identify different tree species and be able to differentiate between them. And similarly with the wild foods, if you're going to eat particularly if you're going to put something in your mouth, you've got to be able to identify it specifically. You can't be sort of vague about that. And I think it might be that, because there's a lot of good wild edibles out there, but there's also some seriously toxic plants. There are fewer seriously toxic plants out there than people worry about. A lot of stuff just doesn't taste that great or isn't particularly edible. But the way I teach people, so you're not just really environment specific, is to kind of have a top-down approach and build some frameworks around. And this is a good way for anybody to think about it. You can pick up some books and start to learn particular plants. And if you're interested in having a broad applicability, which I think is always a good place to start. It's like we start with bow drill often when we're teaching people friction fire, because that's the most widely applicable technique, and then you can kind of subdivide and go into more specific techniques in specific environments with maybe more specific resources that are only available in particular environments. And it's the same with the plants for food, for example. So it's kind of a subset of just learning the trees and plants anyway, because food is one application and fire is another one, and etc. But the way I think about it is to look at the plants that are most widely distributed. And so for the Northern Hemisphere, where a lot of us are that are interested in bushcraft skills, we're in the Northern Temperate. A lot of us, in the sort of from the mid-states in the US upwards, and then you're into the boreal. And it's the same in Europe and Eurasia. We've got this sort of north of Africa, you've got this kind of temperate zone, and then you're into the boreal in Scandinavia. And there's a lot of commonalities there. So starting with the boreal, on our side, you've got forests that go right the way across to Russia and Siberia, but characteristically, there's spruce, there's pine, there's birch, there's some poplar, European aspen, and over on your side of the fence, your side of the pond, you've got spruces, pines, poplars, birches. They're not necessarily the same species, but they sit in the same ecological niche, and they've got similar uses. So you've got this kind of top-down approach, and then you look around and you see, okay, well actually some of the species are the same, like juniper, common juniper. Juniperus communis, it occurs right around the Northern Hemisphere. It's the most widely distributed woody plant on the planet. So you think, well, that's one that's worth knowing. It's good for, you can make cordage from the bark, good tinder, really good friction firewood, good for smoking, use the berries for flavorings. It's a good, good firewood. So it's like that's on my list. And then, cattails, Tifa latifolia. It's the same species that we get on our side of the Atlantic you guys have got over here. And it's got a much wider distribution than that temperate and boreal zone that I've talked about anyway. And then there are other species in that same genus, that Tifa genus, that occur more widely. So you've got lesser reed mace, as we would call it, the smaller cattail, Tifa angustifolia. You've got what the Aboriginals in Australia call kumbungi, which is another Tifa species. I can't remember the species name in the scientific name, but it looks very, very similar, and it's got similar uses. And that's a super useful plant. You can get a lot of calories from it, a lot of complex carbohydrates from it. Tom Luchins the other day was telling me that you can get 7 times weight for weight. You get 7 times more energy from it than you can from potatoes. But either way, it's a really good source of starch right around the year. So as long as you can get into the water to get it, you've got a source of starch. You've also got, you can eat the base of the stalks, as well as the starch from the rhizomes. You've got leaves for, you can make mats, whether that's part of a shelter, whether it's a covering from a ground oven. You can use the pollen. I've taken the pollen, added it to flour, cooked bannocks and dampers and things. Makes it a beautiful, because it's like this sulfur yellow pollen. So you add it into your regular wheat flour, and you can make these like lovely golden, yellow breads and things. But you've got to cook pollen to burst the pollen grains to get the goodness from it. If you just eat the pollen, it just goes straight through you. So you can eat the seed heads at a certain point, like corn on the cob. So it's a really good source of food, really good source of resources. There's some medicine there, there's some fire resources. So that's kind of high on your list as well. So that's the way I think about the trees and the plants. It's like, which are common, which are widespread, which are the super useful ones. Let's learn those ones first. And that's the way I would suggest that other people learn them as well, because then you're getting the biggest bang for your buck. You're getting the biggest distribution of resources. You are more likely to find that plant than you are to one that's more specific to an environment. Not that most of us are going to end up just randomly parachuted into somewhere, but we're traveling, we're going to wilderness areas, we're doing trips. It's like, know the resources you're going to come across first. So, you've got a limited brain capacity. There's only so much you can learn in any given period of time. So learn the stuff that's widest and most useful first, and then you can kind of narrow down and down from that. So that's what I would look at first. So and then learn families as well if you can that are really good. So the Brassicaceae, which is the cabbage and mustard family, there's no poisonous species in that family. So if you can recognize something as a Brassicaceae, you're like, it's got that cruciform flower. They used to be called the cruciferae. They've got four petals in a cross shape. And some other features, typically like little mustard seed pods. Some of them are different, but there are some familial characteristics there that that narrows it down to being a brassica. If you can recognize it as a brassica, then it's not poisonous, and there's thousands of species there. And then also, if you can recognize something that's in the carrot family. Now, there's some really, really good edibles in the carrot family, the Apiaceae, but there's also some seriously poisonous ones. And the problem isn't identifying them as an Apiaceae, because most of them have got these flower umbels, and they're either white or yellow. Often they have pinnate leaf structures, so feathery leaf structures that are divided at least once, sometimes twice. So if you think of flat leaf parsley, or you guys don't call it coriander, cilantro, do you call it? Don't you? Look at those type of feathery, but then you've also got similar plants like poison hemlock, which look very similar, and that's the problem. So there's some great wild edibles, but there's also some seriously poisonous plants. So Cicuta virosa. We call it cowbane, but I think you call it. What do you call it? Can't remember what you call it, but you do get it on this side of the Atlantic as well. So just initially, just forget about the carrots, until you get more sophisticated in your plant identification. You can differentiate between them, but you're going to get more return on your investment, as it were, initially by just ignoring them and focusing on some other ones that are more uniform in their edibility. So that's the other thing. So learn the common, widespread, most useful ones first. then learn families that are benign. So and exclude families that generally aren't so benign. Another one to exclude initially is the Ranunculaceae, which is the buttercup family, because pretty much all of them contain ranunculin, and so they're poisonous. There are some that you can process to make edible, so like Caltha palustris, the marsh marigold, lesser celandine. You don't get lesser celandine over here, I don't think, unless it's been introduced in places. But there are species which you can, they've got small underground storage organs with starch in. At certain times of the year, you can process them to make them less toxic or remove the toxins. But generally, that family is one that you want to avoid because it's got things like aconitums in there, and as well as the general buttercups just being a bit toxic. So ignore those, ignore the carrots, brassicas, rosaceae, for example. Most of the pomes, like the apples and things like that, they're all edible. Service trees, mountain ash, those type of, they might need a bit of processing to make them more palatable. But the plums mostly, although some of the cherries have got too much cyanogenic glycosides in them. So some of the things like cherry laurel, which is a species we have over us, it's got you break the leaves up and it smells of almonds. But then you learn that if anything smells of almonds or marzipan or cherry bakewell, ignore that. But some of those species, because cyanogenic glycosides are driven off by heat, you can do things like we have a bird cherry, which is a bit like your choke cherry, but that's got a lot of cyanogenic glycosides in the pits. But what you do is you crush them up and leave them lying out in the sun, and the heat of the sun drives and you can kind of make these cakes. And that was done in Russia as quite staple food by some peoples. So if you learn about the chemistry, so the rose family is worth investigating certainly before the carrot family, because there's a lot of edibles there. There's a lot of edibles that you'll recognize as edible, and then rose hips are really high in vitamin C, etc., etc. So if you work in that way, in a methodical, widely applicable approach, then you get a lot of resources for the least amount of effort, and that's the way I would go first, and then you can subdivide and nuance beyond that. Well, I hope you found that interesting. It's been really nice chatting. Please subscribe to TJack Survival, fantastic channel, some absolutely awesome interviews with other people on there as well, so don't miss out on those. Make sure you subscribe, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell so you get the notifications. That's really important. YouTube make it harder and harder for us these days. And also, if you've liked what I've talked about, I'd really appreciate you checking out my site at paulkirtley.co.uk, and see you there. Leave a comment, say hi, and thanks for listening. Cheers.